Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. Today we're gonna talk about North Korea and some North Korea related issues.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you, Finnish Bolshevik, for inviting me and giving me this platform and the chance to talk to your subscribers, your listeners, and hopefully people who are still on the fence about, the whole North Korea issue and the pathetic, disgusting propaganda toward this country.
Yeah, so we're particularly gonna focus on the media portrayal of North Korea, or the DPRK.
Yeah, as many people are familiar with this issue, I mean, the beginning of this year, there were already some statements in the media, in the Western media, that, North Korea was developing this long-range missile that was able to deliver nuclear weapons to the US and so on. And what's really interesting that at first when Kim Jong-un was himself making these statements that, they're working on it, they were a bit not even a bit, quite a lot incredulous about this because, it's an archaic regime that is not able to, they just talk shit and they're not able to really develop any sophisticated technology, But with time passing, everyone started realizing that, it's a real issue in quotes for them, and it's really just about time. It's going to happen, And the sanctions and so on, it's not really going to affect it because North Korea is really set on achieving this goal, and of course we started getting all kinds of reactions and news stories, as you remember.
Yeah, I do remember like a couple years ago how in the mainstream media people used to be laughing at them, and I specifically remember, I think it was the Young Turks, this liberal YouTube news show, where they were talking about North Korea's nuclear capability, and they were laughing at them and saying like, they've developed a nuclear device, but because they don't have a missile to launch it, they would have to fly a plane and drop it. So North Korea has now achieved the same level of weapons technology as the United States did in the 1940s. Like, that's what they were saying.
You know what's ridiculous? I mean, to develop a nuclear weapon, you need to have a sophisticated fucking industry. You need to have a scientific base and an education base, And these guys just saying that, so what, they do. In fact, most countries, even if I understand correctly, you can correct me on that one, but even Iran so far is not able to develop their own nuclear weapons, their own nuclear production, And yet North Korea has succeeded in doing that. I mean, that's actually quite a big achievement. And now, like you said, after that they always come up. It's like moving the goalposts.
They were laughing about flying a plane and dropping it from a plane and saying how they don't have a missile, but now they, a couple years later, they now have intercontinental ballistic missiles. So like, nobody's laughing now. Maybe we should talk about the root of this conflict. Like, why does the United States do this? Why do the Western countries that support the United States do this? It is because the DPRK has an independent government, a socialist government, that does not allow Western corporations to go in there and treat them like a third world country, to take over their natural resources, to pollute their environment, to use their citizens as sources of cheap labor and nothing else. The United States does not want independent countries like this. It wants puppet states that open themselves up for Western companies to come in, for these multinational corporations to go in and take everything over. And so the US wants regime change. Just like they want regime change with Iran, just like they wanted regime change with Libya, Afghanistan, so on and so forth. So then to implement regime change, they go through the various options, like, can they coup the government? Well, that doesn't seem to work. Can they topple the government by imposing an economic blockade, sanctions and whatnot? Well, they've been doing the sanctions since, the 1950s, but it hasn't toppled the government. Can they use the military option? Can they invade? Well, that clearly is not a realistic option anymore. The DPRK has been armed to the teeth for the obvious reason that the US wants to attack them just like they've attacked all these other countries, and now they have a nuclear deterrent. A nuclear weapon is not actually a very useful weapon for attacking anybody, especially if the guy you're attacking has a nuclear weapon themselves, but it is a good deterrent. It really makes your opponent not want to attack you. So the military option is not really a realistic possibility either, so they try to boost the sanctions to absolute maximum, like they try to impose as much of an economic embargo on the country as possible to weaken them. They have this arms race going on, so they try to push the DPRK to use as much of their resources in the military as possible to weaken them economically. And then there's the media war. So now we get to the media portrayal of the DPRK. The reason the US has created this insane propaganda mythology around the DPRK and all these news stories about how horrible the country is because they need to justify these inhuman sanctions, these constant military provocations by the United States, and if there ever is a realistic possibility for a military invasion of North Korea, then they need to have this kind of propaganda in place so that they can justify this military invasion. The US is basically in a state of constant war, which is pretty exceptional, so they need some kind of justification for that. The US has annual military drills on the Korean border where they practice the possible invasion of North Korea by the United States. So everybody can ask themselves, like, who is being aggressive here? The North Koreans are not practicing invading the US, let alone doing it on the US border, but the US has troops permanently settled on the Korean peninsula where every single year they practice invading the North. So if that's not provocation, I don't know what is provocation then. If the US truly wanted peace, then they would try to de-escalate the situation. They would try to calm things down instead of making all these provocations. They would lessen the sanctions. They would remove the sanctions. They would negotiate. They would not perform military drills.
Especially for a country like North Korea that needs to be, I mean, they are already self-reliant to a large extent, but for example, their land is not of the best quality. So to produce enough food, they need lots of fertilizers, and they rely on energy imports and so on. And I mean, to sanction that, it's quite disgusting, I mean, it's clearly a threat to the people, not just to the elite, like they always say. And once again, what I'm going to say now, what you just said, it's quite obvious to people who understand this topic in detail. But to those who still have doubts about North Korea and are on the fence about this issue, I mean, now they sanction the country, and then, I mean, it's quite obvious, but still, many people don't understand it. And then when the sanctions are in place, they come up with stories about how the people are suffering. And I mean, now all of a sudden, the sanctions are not mentioned. The people are suffering because of the elite, because of the regime, because of the economic system. But the sanctions are, I mean, how do you just remove these from the equation, This is what's really obvious and so annoying to me.
So let's get into some of the news stories. So in the news, they try to give this impression that the DPRK, North Korea, is an aggressive country, an evil country, most of all, an irrational country.
Yeah, the irrational actor, the famous phrase that they use,
That's always the image they try to push, like, they're just crazy.
The classical explanation, they're crazy, The leader, Kim Jong-un, he's crazy,
They use this circular reasoning, like, even though the news stories that we have about them are crazy, you should still believe them, because that's just how crazy North Korea is. In fact, there's nothing crazy about North Korea's policy. They want a nuclear deterrent so that the US can't attack them. It's very logical. The US doesn't exactly have a peaceful track record, like, the US always calls its enemies rogue states, but if any state truly is a rogue state, then it's the United States. Why would anybody put down their weapons when the United States every single year just attacks other countries, bombs them to absolute ruin? Why would anybody put down their weapons in that kind of situation? So the Western media tries to portray North Korea as a crazy country, as an evil country. They try to dehumanize the people of North Korea, like they're not even people, and then they try to say that North Korea is the aggressive one here, while of course it is the US who is occupying half of the Korean peninsula. The US has military bases all over the world because it is an empire, and they also have military bases on the Korean peninsula. Now, is that North Korea being aggressive because they live so close to an American military base? Or is it America being aggressive because they put military bases near everyone else's countries?
So, at the end of November, there came out this story about an escapee, and I think there was even a video, which was super unclear. We said before, if you show this video to someone who did not read, the news, who hasn't heard the word North Korea and so on, if you just play that video to them and ask them if they could provide some kind of description, I'm sure it would be so broad, that how they would describe it. Everyone would have a different opinion.
Basically what happened was, North Korean soldiers apparently shot at this guy who was trying to cross the DMZ. And the Western media then makes a huge deal about this. They talk about it endlessly, how the North Koreans tried to shoot at this guy who was crossing the border. But when South Korean soldiers kill people crossing the border, because it's the DMZ, it's the border between these two countries, and it's very militarized, and you're not supposed to cross it. So South Korean soldiers shoot at people crossing it too, and South Korean soldiers kill people crossing the DMZ. They don't bring that up.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I have this one open now, and you know what's really funny in this news article? I mean, one of the paragraphs goes, he was airlifted to hospital where since undergoing emergency surgery, he has been enjoying watching American crime drama CSI and listening to K-pop music, Dr. Lee Cook-jong said.
Because those are the things that really matter in life, like watching American TV and listening to K-pop music, like, that's totally worth risking your life over. Am I right?
I mean, a lot of people would escape to not see that, you know, and not listen to that. Yeah, but the thing is, you know, just imagine that guy living in North Korea and dreaming of getting out and watch, you know, the first thing he's gonna watch is American crime drama CSI.
Like, America's a horrible war criminal, but at least they got TV shows.
It goes on, look. The pair also watched action movie The Transporter starring Jason Statham, but Lee said, is not yet strong enough to be interrogated about life in the hermit state.
This is so crazy, like, how is this news?
How is that news? And also, I was also wondering why I'm reading this. I was thinking, except for K-pop, which is kind of not that Korean if you think about it, you know, it's like this weird mixtures but I mean, how much South Korean culture is there, you know? It's really cultural imperialism. I mean, they're mentioning some fucking American movies, you know, and music all the time. Think about that, you know? And he's in South Korea. He escaped to South Korea, you know? Once again, a good example of the constant contradiction that they do. The doctor added, the reason that he defected, risking death and facing a barrage of gunshots, was because he had positive hopes about South Korea. So the question is, if it's such a reclusive state, and that's what they claim, you know, they know nothing about what's happening outside of their own borders, how do they know? Why did he have these hopes about South Korea, you know? If they're completely brainwashed and how do they get this information?
And of course they don't say anything about the North Koreans who went to South Korea, but then decided it was horrible and went back to North Korea.
Yeah.
Every hour, every day, this wife and mother says she suffers, living with the consequences of what she calls a horrible mistake. The wrong choice I made, my choice of wanting to earn money for my treatment, led to the worst situation of my life, says Kim Ryeon-hee. Kim went to China 4 years ago, seeking medical care for liver disease, but found she couldn't afford it. She says a broker tricked her into going to South Korea, promising she'd make a lot of money to pay her bills. Kim says she didn't realize once she signed the papers renouncing her North Korean citizenship, she could never go home. Desperate to return to her family, Kim says she pretended to be a North Korean spy, hoping to be deported, instead ending up in prison. Today, she's out on parole, working at a recycling plant. Kim says she's trapped in South Korea. Her arms bear the scars of multiple suicide attempts. In Pyongyang, I meet Kim's husband and 21-year-old daughter, who hasn't seen her mom since she was 17. She asks why. Why can't she come back? Why do we have to go through such suffering? To my wife in South Korea, don't forget, here you have parents, a husband and daughter, and a socialist nation. Keep on fighting until the end.
Actually, they said it themselves just before you sent me this link, that the information we get about North Korea is very unreliable because of the reclusiveness of the country, you know.
Yeah, this information, it comes usually from South Korean sources, South Korean newspapers, South Korean tabloids, obviously the South Korean government, and the corporations that are in South Korea. Obviously they don't like North Korea. Officially they're still at war with North Korea. So the information they give about the North is always exactly like this, really hostile war-era propaganda against the North.
With DPRK drone news, a South Korean television network, YTN, has come forward admitting that they falsified a photo of Kim Jong-un with a supposed DPRK drone. The television station on Saturday came forward admitting that they had falsified the photo. The photo was claimed to have come from the KCNA, has now been proven to have been doctored by the network.
Then American newspapers and American media outlets, they take this information that South Korea gives them, they spread it around, and then the media of smaller countries, like Finland or Sweden or whatever, our media merely takes what we get from the American media and then they translate it. They don't investigate any of this themselves, they just translate what the Americans are saying.
Yeah, of course. It's exactly, it's just translated. That's it. I've noticed that too, you know. Like you said before, you know, it's either to some unknown reporters, you know, what was that radio station? Free Asia's radio or something like that?
Radio Free Asia, which is not even in Asia, it's actually based in Washington. It's an American puppet, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I've checked their websites and the reporters and the funding, who they get the funding from, and yeah, that's quite suspicious, you know. For example, the New York Times is a very famous news outlet. So you open some story about North Korea, and then, you know, they provide some link to the source. You open that, it's them again, you know, the same newspaper that goes, and then it's like it's going in circles to the same newspaper, and then it might end up with some unknown sources in South Korea or some unknown agencies in South Korea. Or it might just end up there, you know, in the New York Times somewhere, you know.
Yeah, like whenever you're reading these North Korea news stories, there's never any good source. The newspaper might use a previous article of their own as a source. They might use another Western newspaper as a source, and then eventually it might go back to like one of those South Korean newspapers, but that's where you hit a dead end, because then it's just gonna say like, oh, according to an unnamed person, or according to this anonymous official, they said this. So it's basically just all made up. There's no real source. So let's take a look at some of the other Western news sources, because, you know, this was Metro, it's a crappy little tabloid. So let's take a look at some of these other ones.
Yeah. North Korea nuclear scientist deported by China commits suicide before interrogation. It says here, the defector was a lead researcher in the physics department of the State Academy of Sciences in Pyongyang. You know, once again, you always label this country as a backward, as, you know, undeveloped. And yet he's a lead researcher that, you know, in the physics department, they have to have a physics department, and so, and I'm pretty sure if it's of a high quality. Of course, if you say that, you're a brainwashed believer, a commie, you know, who doesn't understand anything, they have nothing, you know, the North Koreans, they could never have a real physicist, you know, and yet they're able to develop nuclear weapons. What's crazy in this story, that it goes according to the radio, that's the source, according to the radio station. It doesn't, I was trying to find what radio station. It's not there. It's not in the text. You can take a look at it later, but it's not there, you know. And then there is a big quote in bold. He died before he could be questioned about the reasons for his escape. Anonymous source. And that's all, you know. That's the whole article. There is really no more sources, no more nothing.
Now, if I was forced to guess, then I would say that probably none of that ever took place. Somebody might ask, like, whoa, do you really think that the newspaper would just invent stuff? Well, how about I give you a story where it's absolutely blatantly obvious that they did just invent stuff. In this story, it was supposedly a nuclear scientist. In this next one that I'm about to show you, it's like a biologist, a guy who was supposedly working on biological weapons and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So, this is a Daily Mail article that says that North Korean scientist defects to Finland with evidence of chemical warfare tests carried out on humans. That's basically some James Bond villain type stuff. Chemical warfare tests carried out on humans. It says, researcher was part of a secretive country's chemical weapons program, fled North Korea with storage device carrying evidence of human testing, and set to offer testimony to European Parliament to bring attention to issue. This is particularly crazy. It says, last year military defectors said their training involved biological weapons drill using disabled children.
Yeah.
That is fucking crazy.
Why do they? Let me guess. They use disabled children because they cannot work in concentration camps. And
yeah, like this is so crazy. This is like absolute. This is not news. And it's the Daily Mail. Okay, right-wing British newspaper. And of course, there's no actual source. There's no evidence of any of this.
But why disabled children? Why not disabled men, or adults? Why children?
It sounds more evil if it's disabled children, I guess. Like, I'm surprised it doesn't say, like, oh, they used innocent little puppy dogs or something.
Yeah.
The reason that I heard about this is because it mentions Finland, and I'm Finnish, and it was actually on the Finnish news, like on the radio and TV. So Helsinki Times, Finnish newspaper, actually looked into this because they were like, oh wow, is this like, this North Korean is defecting to Finland? Like, oh, that's crazy. So they looked into it, and they put out an article that says, quote, North Korean scientist never defected to Finland. Never. They contacted all the authorities who would know about this. They tried to contact the original source of this claim, and they couldn't find any evidence that this defector ever even existed. Furthermore, the reason we know for absolute certainty that this is bullshit and this never happened is because, according to the rumor, this guy was supposed to testify in front of the European Parliament, which also never happened. They never testified in front of the European Parliament. So we can say with absolute certainty that this was just made up, and they were stupid enough to make a specific claim about Finland, and then they probably thought, like, Finland is just a small, shitty country, nobody knows about them, nobody's gonna actually fact-check any of this.
And it says here, I'm reading this news article right now, it says here, the report published by Yonhap, who was cited by several international news outlets such as Newsweek and The Independent, so it was a big story, cited by many.
Yonhap is a horrible South Korean newspaper, and they basically just invented a bunch of bullshit, and everybody used it.
And can I ask you, do you think the rejection by the Finnish reporters, do you think that was reported in The Independent and so on?
No, certainly not. And even if they do make a correction, like, most people obviously are not going to see the correction, they're only going to see the first thing.
Oh my God. It's a great example, just what you said, just to talk one more time about the numbers of, the defectors phenomenon, first of all, there are defectors everywhere, in every bordering states, there are defectors. I'm pretty sure there are defectors even from the U.S. to Mexico, and not even mentioning the other way around, and from the U.S. to Canada. Why this is such a big thing that there is a defector or two, we have tons of people migrating from Mexico to the U.S. Of course, no one is ever mentioning that the evil capitalist regime in Mexico, makes people want to leave, and so on.
There's two examples that are particularly funny, which so perfectly illustrate that you really can't trust what the media says about the DPRK. So this first one, it's from Newsmax, and it says, North Korean students are required to have their leader's haircut, the Kim Jong-un haircut. I would recommend that everybody go check out a video called The Haircut. I'll put the link in the description. What that video is, it's basically these two guys who wanted to test this insane haircut hypothesis, and they wanted to see if people in North Korea truly have to get the Kim Jong-un haircut or not. So they traveled to North Korea to get a haircut, and turns out, they just get a normal haircut like any other. So the news story is entirely false.
That by itself is already silly.
Yes, that by itself is already really silly. Like, it's entirely false, and it's, ridiculous that a newspaper would even print stuff like this. But that is not all, because now Newsmax, the same newspaper, has put out a story which says that North Koreans are not allowed to get the Kim Jong-un haircut. In other words, a story which entirely contradicts their previous story. The first story says that they are required to get it, and the second story says that they're not allowed to get it. These two things entirely mutually exclude one another, and yet they're printed as truth. They are printed as news, as if this was something that really happens, but it's just fantasy, like it's fiction. It's baseless. Yet they print it in a newspaper.
Also, just to top it off, there was this story about the unicorn. Can you...
The unicorn story is my favorite North Korea-related news story in the Western media.
And it's in the Guardian,
So yeah, first we had like a bunch of these shitty tabloids, and then we had the Daily Mail, a noted right-wing newspaper, and now we have The Guardian, a liberal or quasi-left-wing newspaper. So we can really see that the whole spectrum of the capitalist press is exactly identical when it comes to North Korea. They all lie exactly the same way. So basically what happened was, a bunch of North Korean archaeologists, they found this ancient stone ruin which related to this ancient king who had some kind of legend or something to do with unicorns. And in this stone construction that they found, there were words that said unicorn lair. The discovery that the North Koreans made was actually an archaeological discovery relating to an ancient kingdom which had this legend of unicorns about it. But they never actually said that they found a real unicorn lair with real unicorns or something.
Looks real to me. I'm looking at it now. That's good. That's like 2 weeks of Photoshop classes, you know.
So the Western media then takes this and they say, oh, look at these stupid North Koreans, they believe in unicorns. It is a deliberate lie. It shows they have absolutely zero journalistic integrity. The North Koreans never claimed to actually have found real unicorns. It doesn't even make any sense, since ancient Koreans wouldn't even know about the kind of Western idea of a unicorn as a horse with a horn on its head. There's a good video about this done by this Korean teacher. I'll put the link in the description for that as well. She talks about this story in particular, so I recommend you check that out.
So the first example is a news story that broke in 2012. That made North Korea again the butt of many jokes and a laughingstock for seeming delusional and crazy with outlandish claims. The Guardian was just one among many news outlets that circulated the story about how North Korea discovered a unicorn lair. The story was actually based on a press release by North Korea's own central news agency, and here is an excerpt from that original published in English, upon which some of these other news was based. So there are North Korean news websites with their own perspective, and yet, and these are very readily available online, and yet these are rarely consulted to learn more about North Korea. So what this example does is to, what you can do with this particular example is to use it to teach students about the importance of checking multiple sources. You can have a discussion about how better to understand the story in a way that makes sense without making North Korea seem like it's a crazy place. So here I've underlined some of the important points that could have led any careful reader of the original North Korean article to conclude that largely what the story is trying to do is to say that archaeologists discovered an ancient site with words referring to unicorn lair carved in the rocks, which are based on ancient texts that associated the legend of King Dongmyeong with Pyongyang as the ancient capital of the Goguryeo Kingdom, which is dated to more than 2,000 years ago. The news is really about an archaeological discovery that gave Pyongyang legitimacy as the ancient capital of Korea, rather than Seoul in South Korea.
And you know what's really pathetic? That people who read these articles and who buy into that and who constantly shout, you know, North Korea, their regime and so on, they think that they are the enlightened ones, you know. To disentangle this, that will take a lot of effort because, I mean, it becomes a very deep question of, for example, people believing, you know, that they can rely on the media and so on. So think about it, it's taking decades of really powerful propaganda. Like you said, you know, you can't just make it up and start out of nothing, you know. You have to develop a certain strategy and keep pounding on it. And
yeah, like, back in the day, they used to say crazy things about Saddam Hussein, like, never this crazy, but still crazy. They used to say that Saddam was, like, worse than Hitler, and Saddam's troops deliberately took, like, babies out of incubators to kill them.
Yeah.
Crazy stuff like that. Obviously, you know, to justify the invasion of Iraq. It's the same thing as this. They're trying to justify aggressive policy towards North Korea with this.
Even now, for example, when the Western liberals still admit that the U.S. made a big mistake by going into Iraq, they still do not deny the fact that the lies about this, about Saddam Hussein, I mean, they still say, yeah, that's true, but we shouldn't have gone there, you know. I mean, because we created a war situation. You know what I mean? Still, the story about, you know, the crazy dictator is still there, you know?
Yeah, like, people know that there were no weapons of mass destruction, like, that was all a lie. Especially liberals, they're still, like, so gung-ho about, like, Iran still probably has nukes, and Syria and Assad, he probably has biological weapons, or like, surely if the media says that Assad is killing innocent civilians with biological or chemical weapons, then surely he must actually be doing it, like, because the media would never lie, right? The media would never lie to justify a war. And surely the North Koreans are actually crazy. The media would never lie about something like this. They're so gung-ho to go to war again, even though they know that the previous war was bullshit, the wars before that were bullshit, but somehow they still believe the things that are being said right now. They're probably gonna turn around and say that we're like some kind of conspiracy theorists and like tinfoil hat people, when we're really just believing the evidence of our own eyes. Like, you can clearly see that these North Korea stories are demonstrably false. Not only are they laughable, but they are demonstrably false. And you could say, oh, it's just an honest mistake, guys. The media just made an honest mistake. But, like, how many honest mistakes do you make? Like, they don't make these kinds of mistakes about any other country. They don't think that, like, Finland accidentally found unicorns. No, it's just about North Korea. It's not a mistake. It's a deliberate propaganda campaign to justify aggressive foreign policy.
There is dubious stories and there is completely nonsensical stories that, because of the constant background propaganda, kind of play into the whole big picture of the irrational regime, and people just, they don't need to investigate, they don't need to think, they read it, and, you know, it actually reinforces the view, you know.